All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Dr. Charles Mueller. I am the director of the Regulatory Science and Engineering Center here at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. I'd like to thank you all for coming out today for what I am sure is going to be a fantastic conversation about a really important set of regulations that is impacting all of society. For 20 years, the Potomac Institute their mission has been to support policy influenced by good science, technology, and rationalism, rather than by personal beliefs and feelings. Good policy should come from good science. For 20 years, we've interpreted that to mean that policy and the laws the United States is governed by should be based upon rationalism, science, and technology. The Institute takes great effort to help legislators of the United States develop policy that follow those tenets. We are all about policy for better S&T and using S&T to help create better policy. Recently, though, the Potomac Institute recognized that the policy of the United States was becoming more regulatory than legislative in nature. That is where the Regulatory Science and Engineering Center comes in. This Center of Excellence is all about applying scientific principles, those founded in rational, logical thought, to the processes we use to design, implement, enforce, and manage our regulatory process. Over the past year, RSEC has been engaged in a scholarly investigation of how regulations are developed and the underpinning legislation that the process of developing regulations in the United States is based upon. During this investigation, we've begun to focus on large sets of regulations that appear to be having huge impacts on society. We believe that large sets of regulations that are impacting society and are not justified in rational, logical thought need to be redone or thrown out entirely. During our investigation, we began to explore the impacts of a very large set of regulations known as the ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. Today's seminar is about the impact of the ITAR on industry. On our panel today, we have the right people here to talk about the issue. Today, you will hear from Ms. Lindsay Meyer, a managing partner at Venable LLP, Ms. Peggy Evans, a senior fellow here at the Potomac Institute, and Ms. Candace Goforth, the founder and managing director of Goforth Trade Advisors. Before I introduce them a bit more, I'd like to turn things over now to Dr. Hummel, the Potomac Institute's chief scientist, for some brief opening remarks about the topic we'll be discussing. Dr. Hummel has worked with the ITAR issues for about 20 years, and we welcome his input.
Very good. Thank you, Charles, and thank you all for coming. On behalf of Mr. Michael Swetnam, the CEO of the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and General Al Gray, the chairman and chairman of the Board of Regents of the Institute, I wish to welcome you to the Institute here. The Institute is a 501c3 not-for-profit public policy research institute, as many of you know. The mission is to identify and shepherd discussions on key science and technology issues facing society. The goal is, from these discussions and forums, to develop meaningful science and technology policy options and ensure their implementation at the intersection of business and government. And of course, today we're focusing on business and the international traffic in arms regulations. Thank you, Charles, and thank you to the RSEC Center, the Regulatory Science and Engineering Center, for sponsoring this, which is formally the second in a series of forums of this sort where we're discussing the ITAR laws, the ITAR regulations, and their impacts. Now, and of course, this is central to the notion of business and government and their interaction in terms of science and technology. So it's central, it's very much of interest to the Potomac Institute, and I hope of interest to you. ITAR is something that I personally have been following since my university days and then working in government at DARPA. In fact, at DARPA, I asked the general counsel to give me a deeper education about the understanding of the origins of ITAR. They did that, and so when this topic arose in the context of the Regulatory Science and Engineering Center, I wrote an article on the topic, and that's been handed out here. It's part of the STEPS journal. STEPS stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Policy Studies, which is a scholarly magazine. I happen to be the the editor-in-chief of this magazine. And in the second issue, we have an article about ITAR. Let me hasten to add that articles and steps are not official positions of the Potomac Institute. This is this article, which I stand behind. I actually agree with the article, but it's a personal opinion of myself and my co-authors. And that the idea of steps, by the way, is it's a bold, non-peer reviewed. It's carefully edited, carefully reviewed, but not peer reviewed. Therefore, articles which you are welcome to submit to are encouraged to be bold and to take bold positions that that might otherwise be watered down if they had to receive the approbation of one's peers. In that article, I take the position that ITAR is more harmful than good. That's a personal position. It's not a starting position for our discussion, but it is intended to, as I spoke about the mission of the Potomac Institute, foster discussion and encourage and shepherd discussion on the topic. Today, the topic is the impact of ITAR on industry. And let me just briefly mention to again, foster discussion, that the origin of ITAR, the original enabling legislation, which I believe was 1976, it's discussed in my article, had in mind two benefits to the nation and to industry. Benefit one was that it was supposed to help us economically by virtue of preventing others from obtaining technologically important science and understanding. Therefore, we could continue to dominate in areas of technology and products thereof. So it was supposed to benefit industry by helping industry not lose access to a dominant position in technology. It was also intended to help national security by virtue of making sure that defense articles did not show up rapidly in adversary domains. Now, this is a bit of a nuisance to industry because it says that without an export license, they can't sell defense articles overseas. But that is supposed to help engender a national security regime which keeps our country strong and again benefits our industries. So the original intention of the law and thus the enabling regulations was to benefit the nation both economically and through national security. And today's discussion, I hope, helps the Institute develop recommendations that, that steer things in a beneficial direction while mitigating or getting rid of negative aspects of the regulations. And with that, Dr. Mueller, would you like to introduce our panelists and speakers? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hummel. So it's with great pride and pleasure that I'm able to introduce our first panelist here, Ms. Lindsay Meyer, who is a managing co-partner at Venable, and heads the international trade practice, assisting sophisticated companies to efficiently import and export under U.S. laws and regulations. As a licensed U.S. custom broker, Ms. Meyer has a detailed knowledge of and extensive experience with regulations of the U.S. Bureau of Customs and Border Protection. She is also the co-chair at Venable's FCPA and anti-corruption practice. For over 25 years, Ms. Meyer has provided international trade and customs advice at Venable, where she heads Venable's international practice based in Washington, D.C. Ms. Meyer concentrates on all aspects of international trade and customs matters. She regularly advises companies on their compliance with import and export control laws and regulations and appears before numerous regulatory bodies, such as the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, International Trade Commission, Commerce Department, Bureau of Industry and Security, the State Department's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, and the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Now, I have about 2 other pages of things that I can tell you about how wonderful and qualified she is to talk about this issue. But rather than do that, I'll turn things over now to Ms. Meyer and let her take it from here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mueller. It's an introduction that only your mother could really appreciate. So my name is Lindsay Meyer. I'm delighted to be with you all today. I hope this is interactive. I hope we have a dialogue, a discussion, because frankly, that's more interesting for both me and for you. And I know my panelists have agreed as well. But before we get into the true discussion, I want to make sure that we're all starting from the same point so that we have a base understanding. So I'm going to just set the table a little bit in terms of what the context is like before we get into the nitty-gritty, rolling out the reality, the business reality of how you deal with these laws and regulations. So just to make sure that everybody has an understanding. Oh, that's my firm. Okay, great firm, big in DC, headquartered there. That's my little promo for that. So let's jump in. So the focus today obviously is on the ITAR. And as Dr. Hummel said, it's been out there for many years. Its original goals were economic and national security, as the original intent. If you look to the federal rulemaking process, that's obviously a focal point for the Institute. You want to understand how it works. They want to understand basically how does this rulemaking work in this context. You want to understand the criteria that are used to assess this. How does it work? Where is it not working well? You want to examine its impact on society, and then most importantly, analyze its effectiveness on implementing a positive change. So when the rubber meets the road. So how can we best initiate a positive change to serve those original goals along with the ITAR, International Traffic in Arms Regulations, and their current state of reform? Now, being a practitioner in Washington, I fall into the alphabet soup speak. So if I say an acronym that you're not familiar with, please stop me, raise your hand, whatever. I'll try not to do it, but it does become my habit, I must say. So if we look first off at what are the 3 basic agencies that govern U.S. export controls, clearly the one that people think about most often is the ITAR. So that's U.S. Department of State, the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls is the licensing arm, and the ITAR in and of itself is the regulatory scheme that governs defense articles and defense services. So it's the big things that go bang. That's what most people think of. However, there are a lot of things beyond the big things that go bang that are also obviously controlled within the ITAR. If you then take a step back and you say, okay, mine isn't something that's controlled on the U.S. munitions list or USML, that's the affirmative listing that governs the controlled items under the ITAR, then what else? So if it's something of U.S. origin or something in the United States, then it would be under the jurisdiction of the Commerce Department and the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS. That agency has its own set of regulations. The Export Administration Regulations, or EAR, like your ear. That governs basically everything else of a civil and or dual use. So that doesn't mean that it's necessarily controlling it, and I'll show you some stats later, but it's within the purview of the Commerce Department if it doesn't fall within state. And then lastly, and frankly when we've seen and certainly read about in our newspapers of late, is the Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, and that's the agency that governs the sanctions, the embargoes. So everyone's familiar with the longstanding embargoes on Iran and Cuba, which of late have seen some modifications, and then the more recent ones, the Russia-Ukraine. So those are generally the 3. There's certainly some others, nuclear regulatory, DOE, there's some others that don't play as significant a role as these 3. So that's the broad framework when we talk about export controls. So in August of 2010, the Obama administration announced the need and the interest in export control reform, or ECR. So the thought there was, okay, we've been living with this system. It's antiquated. It hasn't necessarily kept up. So what do we want to do? Well, here the goal is to simplify and streamline trade in controlled items with both NATO countries and our non-NATO allies. Okay, that sounds worthy, right? Sounds like a reasonable thing. In order to effectuate that, the thought was to move those items that are less restricted, but currently existing on the USML, over to the Commerce Control, thinking we're moving it from a more strict, stringent control environment to a less strict, but still controlled environment under the Commerce Department. The notion and the phraseology that's been used is to place higher fences around a smaller number of defense items, or higher fences around the defense crown jewels, if you will. So the concept on this export control reform was to implement the 4 singles. And as you can see up there, a single control list. So rather than having USML, the CCL, the sanctions list, merging all of those into one single control list, a single licensing agency, a single IT platform, and a single primary, they didn't give it all the way, but single primary enforcement agency. So that was the structure of the plan back in August 2010. Now, we've advanced since then, obviously, and it's interesting to see, here's a model. So you can see the USML, the CCL, and then the sanctions, rather merging that over and developing kind of a tier 1. So the tier 1 would be effectively the defense, tier 2 would be commerce, tier 3 lesser, so staging the level of control to meet more of the demand and, frankly, the global need. So that was the idea. Okay, so with that in mind, let's just look at where we are today. So recent trade stats, this is pulling 2014. You can see the green line there in the middle is exports. So exports, and again, part of the Obama administration's intent was to spur exports to make U.S. industry globally competitive, not dissimilar from the original goals of the ITAR. So you can see there that really, even since 2010, since the initiative was announced, the gains on the export side they're there, but they're modest. Conversely, the increase on the imports, which is the blue box on the top, have been more significant. So we're continuing to see an influx of goods. We are seeing an increase in exports, but to a lesser extent. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit more. So this was from the BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security update that occurred a couple of weeks ago. I thought this was kind of a nifty slide to just summarize things. Actual exports, again, this is 2014 calendar year, were 1.6 trillion. So now the way it was discussed here was that 1.5 trillion of those were exported under no license required. Okay, so you think, wow, that's fabulous. Those controls must be non-existent. But the reality is the vast bulk of our exports are for shoes or boxes or whatnot. So it's not the strategic items. So let's break it down again further. If you look at the licensed exports, 59.4 billion were under a government license. So it's 3.7% of all the exports. Okay. Now, query, what would that number have been if our controls were lesser? Perhaps greater. Breaking that down further, you see the vast majority there, 35.2 billion were licensed by State Department. So that's our big chunk right there in the middle. And then the 16.1 billion are licensed. Those are the Commerce Control license. But that's sort of a misnomer because 12.3 of that is for crude oil. So that's a big swath of high-value goods that's being exported. And then 8.1 billion is licensed by other, OFAC, NRC, et cetera. So really what we're talking about is looking at the two combined, really the 16.1 and the 35.2. Those are ones with controls that are licensed. But that's really not the full picture. Here's just looking at it in a different depiction. You see the chart, for those who can't read it. On the far left is ITAR licensed. The second from the left is ITAR exemptions and or agreements, which I'll talk about later, so hold that thought. Then the NRC, OFAC, BIS, and then NLR. So that's no license required. And that's frankly what was being promoted as, you know, look at the increase in exports where there's no license required. Isn't that a good thing? But I think that actually masks the issue. Okay, so if we look at the 37.1 billion, the 5% that's under a government license exception under State Department, license exemption, or agreement, you still have to undergo that whole analysis. So business is saying, well, that's great. I can apply an exception or an exemption or work out an authorized agreement. But you still have to go through that analysis because technically it's within the jurisdiction of this. It just means that you get the freebie. You don't have to actually go and apply for the license and get the formal license. So that portion of it, while not technically controlled because an exemption applies, it still has the analysis that you have to undertake. And business looks at that just as much as they look at the ones where you have to go get the license. Okay, so where are we today? We think back about the goals, the 4 singles. Okay, so let's see where we are. 3 agencies still remain. Yes, there's been some migration. And in fact, the government on both the State Department and the Commerce Department have carefully analyzed each of the categories to figure out where they can migrate. Yet, we still have 21 categories on the MSL. So the categories, it's not like we're saying, well, we went from 21 and now we only have 5. Not true. Was 21, still 21. And frankly, I think the complexity has increased because the ones that were on the USML that have now migrated to the Commerce Control List are under what's called a 600 series. So it's a special designation. So you know they were controlled under state, now they're controlled under commerce. The challenge there is it's a more complex analysis. In my opinion, having done this for 28 years, 20-some years, it's complex. And I think, frankly, the commerce regulations in many respects are more complicated than the ITAR, than the USML. USML, it's on there, boom, you're in. Maybe you can find an exception, but for the most part. On the other hand, the commerce controls, it's a who, what, when, where. What is it? Where is it going? Is there an exception? Does it fall within the specs? It's a much more patchwork of an analysis. So for business, what does that mean for business? Well, it becomes more complicated. You can't just say, well, it's on the list or not on the list. You have to work with your engineers. You have to get a real deep understanding of precisely what is controlled to figure out where it can go. Yes, it can go to France. No, it can't go to India and the like, and the reason for those controls. So you also have multiple licensing agencies, so that hasn't been brought down to a single entity yet. It's more confusing than ever because, frankly, you're thinking, well, do I go to state? Do I go to commerce? Where do I go? I don't know. Oh, and don't forget about OFAC. They may come after you, too. So it's challenging. It's a challenging environment. And I think the most significant thing is while it was a great intent back in August of 2010, frankly, the president could only take things so far. That really, in order to fully implement that, yes, you can make certain regulatory changes, but in many respects, you really needed legislative change. So we can work this way down that path, but to have the full 4 singles be implemented, it would have required some legislative modifications. Okay, so with the table now set as the backdrop, U.S. companies are facing global competition. So what's our impact? And does the original model, or even the current, as it's now changed, meet the changing business realities? And this is really what we're hoping to talk with you all about today and hear your ideas and your thoughts. So it clearly has been an evolution on defense articles and tech data. There has been, from U.S. perspective, looking to compete globally, there's been certainly a wind of developing items that are ITAR free, developing things that don't include U.S. content, don't include U.S. technology, such that these rules and regulations don't come into effect. There's also an intent where if you have a U.S. entity has a non-U.S. operation to basically just completely wall off and not have the U.S. participation. So that's been a bit of the evolution over the last several years, which is frankly a mismatch to global business operations. So if you face that idea of having things ITAR free, and then you take a step back and you go, well, what does business look like today? It's global. So you've got multinational businesses, that's common. You have a fluid exchange of technology, R&D in joint developments. You see strong commercial market, which leads to increased investment in the U.S. So you've got, increase in CFIUS filings, Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. When ownership comes in, foreign-owned or controlled operations. And then the latest one of tax inversion pushing U.S. headquarters overseas, So business is global these days. And that's true whether you're talking about commercial market or whether you're talking about the defense market. It also fails to consider the movement of personnel. You see a lot more secondment, you see intra-company training, you see trainees coming back and forth, crossing borders really with great ease. And then finally, you see collaboration and tiered program development, where one entity in one particular geographic location may partner with another organization as either a sub, a prime, joint venture partner, or the like. That's the reality of business today. So if you think of that kind of fluid movement across borders, whether it's people, technology, ideas, widgets, whatever it is, that's the reality. And now if you say, okay, let's try and put that square box of what business is into the round hole of export controls, it's not a perfect fit. Okay. In addition, we have, certainly after 9/11, and again reinforced after the events in Paris, heightened concern over enforcement, additional challenges that are facing companies. So it's not only understanding the rules and doing the right thing. Most U.S. business, they want to do the right thing. They want to understand it. But enforcement, and not surprisingly, penalty cases have been at an all-time high. You also see, unlike what we saw initially was a single agency would investigate. Now it's a much more collaborative and coordinated effort. So one agency will start an investigation and then others will often play me too because they'll have a hand in it as well. So you'll often see an export control investigation, be it at State Department or Commerce Department, with a joint Treasury Department with OFAC. You know, something that was controlled went somewhere it shouldn't have gone. And oh, by the way, we have embargoes or sanctions on that as well. You also can oftentimes see stepwise anti-corruption and export control violations. And sometimes one leads the other. Sometimes government DOJ will be following the money for purposes of an anti-corruption case, and lo and behold, the money will lead to product or technology that's also in the hands of someone who shouldn't have it. Additionally, you see the complexity of the controls and sanctions. I mentioned that before, and I think this is an important part because it's become such a center point for our trade policy these days. I think the administration has moved from what I would consider to be more straightforward embargo programs, where it's essentially a full stop, you can't do business. You as a U.S. person or as a business in the U.S., you can't do business with Iran, Cuba, etc. Now, if you think about the most recent set of regulations that have been put in place, the Ukraine-Russian sanctions, they're targeted, and they're targeted for a reason. They're developed on 4 different directives focused on not only financial institutions and more specifically the particular transactions, so debt, as well as certain industries, financial, defense, energy. So they're targeted at certain people and certain entities dealing within that sphere. So frankly, as a business person, it was easier to say, oh, I can't do business with this country and the folks there. Got it. But now you have to say, well, with whom am I dealing? I'm dealing with this person. Oh, and by the way, are they owned or controlled 50% by someone who's on a particular list? Okay, so now you got to drill down on your due diligence even further. So that's the reality, and that's what I consider, a more challenging environment from a regulatory standpoint. So if you combine all of that with the enforcement creep and the focus that had traditionally been targeted on U.S. entities, I would say enforcement on export controls and sanctions has been targeted of late on U.S. persons, but equally on individuals, as well as on non-U.S. affiliates. So, in the export control world, I say the U.S. has a long arm and a heavy hand. We take some extra jurisdictional reach elsewhere. But that's important to bear in mind if you think back that we are in a global environment. So we've got multiple forces at issue here. We've got this change in foreign policy, the forces that play there from a political standpoint. We've got the globalization of business. And the question is, has ITAR kept up? It's hard because we're still dealing with the 1974 model, modified slightly to try and achieve those goals, but it's kind of rubbing right up against what businesses are trying to do and trying to achieve. So the ECR goals, have they been met thus far? Okay, the goal, make U.S. business more competitive. Really, has enough changed yet? In my personal opinion, I don't think so. We've got heightened due diligence, we've got more CFIUS actions, foci concerns, businesses are more nervous, and frankly, for good reason. Another goal at ECR was to make it easier for small and medium-sized businesses. Well, the reality is, for small and medium-sized businesses that don't have the resources to really dive into these regulations and fully understand them or appreciate them, it's frankly more complex and more challenging for them on a day-to-day basis. Now, what about larger companies? The big defense contractors, how are they doing? Well, frankly, the risks are so much greater, the compliance demands are so much greater that all comes with increased costs. And the larger operations tend to be more multinational as well. So they've got those heightened concerns and risks. So what about enforcement? Okay, I mentioned this before. The enforcement is now, the intent was to focus on the non-compliant persons and entities. Okay, we want to get the bad guys. But the reality is all of these laws have strict liability, which is a fancy way of saying no intent is needed. If you shipped it and it was in violation, you broke the law. So you can't say, well, I didn't know or I didn't mean to. All that goes out the window. So strict liability is a very challenging issue for business to deal with. Again, think back. Think the small mom and pop operations. Can they keep up with these set of regulations? It's challenging. So I would say the fences are definitely higher, but so are the stakes. And I think with that, hopefully I've set the table, kept it on time. Am I doing okay? So that's the backdrop. We'd love to have a dialogue, and I know with my panelists, hopefully I raised a couple of issues, whether it's the transfer of technology, joint development with a university and a private concern, whether it's bringing individuals in. Again, you can bring in someone, as a trainee, and if they're a non-U.S. person, that may be a breach. You may have those concerns as well. And then certainly if you add on the layer of classified and the NISPOM regulations as well, that further enhances the importance of and the challenges that businesses face. So shall we start the discussion?
We can absolutely start the discussion.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lindsay Meyer. That was very interesting, and maybe I'll start the discussion with you, and then we can broaden it and also hear from our other panelists soon. But at the end, touching upon strict liability brings to mind the thought of the original numbers that you showed us in terms of exports and increasing the exports that aren't necessarily subject to the regulations. But what that misses is, and especially because of the strict liability issue, the chilling effect of the suppression that happens. And my impression is, and again, I say this in the article, but it's not based necessarily on BIS numbers or any hard facts, but my impression is that a lot of small businesses, a lot of businesses would love to export and collaborate and work in this global industrial environment. And simply say, well, I can't because I just don't want to deal with the liability issue. So that, and you even posed the question, how much would the exports be if they simply didn't have to worry about all of that?
I would.
Well, we are recording,
okay.
So just for basically for our own purposes. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm live. Okay, excellent. That's good to know. I would completely agree with that. I think small businesses, to the extent that they're engaged or interested to be engaged in controlled items and working collaboratively, U.S. companies will push the burden to someone else to the extent that they can. They'll say, you know what, we'd love to collaborate, but we will provide it, whether it's through trade terms, how they negotiate their arrangement, where they're giving it to another U.S. organization. So I think if they want to take the risk and go beyond that, it's a huge challenge because, frankly, they don't oftentimes know where to begin. They don't know whether to, whether their operations, the technology that they're developing is controlled. As I said before, where it's controlled, state, commerce, not sure, 600 series, who knows. So oftentimes they'll need to engage in a very, sophisticated analysis and include their engineers, include outside consultants, oftentimes, which small, medium-sized businesses, that's a struggle for. Their margins are quite low. So I think that to the extent that there are clearer lines, if the intent of modification to the ITAR and frankly the whole export control regime is to make a clear, definitive, affirmative list, like you see in other countries, frankly, I think you would see a greater engagement by small and medium-sized companies.
Mm-hmm. So let me be yet more provocative and simply say, that the impact of the law as regards especially small businesses, but a lot of other businesses, is that they look at this and say, if I'm dealing with foreigners, if I'm trying to sell abroad, if I'm trying to collaborate with foreign entities, they're going to get me if they want to get me.
Yes, I think that perception is out there.
Yeah.
And I think the administration, in fairness, has been trying to rebut that by the focal point, as I said in the end, where enforcement has turned traditionally, if you look just at the cases and the investigations historically have been with U.S. companies. Now they're shifting to overseas affiliates, and frankly, I think some of the programs that have been put in place, which were viewed with a skeptical eye initially, some of the voluntary disclosure programs and the like, were a response to that very concern of the gotcha mentality. And so the government said, well, if you come forward with voluntary disclosure, we will look to then mitigate that. And the trading community was saying, well, that's nice, but I'm Missouri, I'm the show me state. Show me where that happened. And the government was having a hard time doing that. So finally, I think it came out of BIS that one of the officials said, look, the starting point will be a 50% of what the penalty would otherwise be. We didn't even talk numbers in terms of penalties, but they're significant, and the zeros add up rather quickly. So I think that was an effort to respond to that concern of that it's a gotcha mentality. But at the end of the day, it's strict liability.
And from industry's standpoint, it seems to be, well, I'll give you this, that the cases that I've seen prosecuted of late
Yes.
have been much more egregious kinds of cases.
Yes.
That if you go back 10 years ago, it was more sort of loosey-goosey, that sort of, oh, you should not have done that. But recently the prosecutions are there may have even been intent. But you're sort of counting on people to say, well, that means I can only sort of violate the regulations, and maybe I'll get away with it. And that's not how we like to do things in the U.S. Let me also further be provocative, because it says in my article that something like 5 years or 6 years into the reform efforts, which I think were probably well-meaning, but these reform efforts have failed, just absolutely, completely failed. And furthermore, by trying harder in reform, you're going to fail again. Because, look, in 6 years, modifying the 21 areas, I mean, by now you should have completely rewritten them all. I mean, just modifying a little bit here and there in a 6-year time period.
On that note,
yeah.
we have someone on the panel today who can speak to this directly. So I I think I'll introduce her.
Thanks, Charles.
Yeah. So Miss Candace Goforth is the managing director of Goforth Trade Advisors, where she provides clients with strategic, practical, day-to-day solutions involving defense trade and export controls. She is a subject matter expert on the international traffic and arms regulations and the export administration regulations. Prior to establishing Goforth Trade Advisors, Candace served as the policy director in the Directorate of Defense Trade and Controls at the U.S. Department of State, which is the authority for the interpretation and implementation of the ITAR. As director, Candace administered the Department of State's implementation of President Obama's Export Control Reform Initiative and was intimately involved in the revision of the U.S. munitions list and commercial control list. Candace was also a key contributor in drafting of the specially designed definition and formulation of the transition plan. So with that, I will turn this over to Candace and let her speak on this issue.
I was going to say that bio sounds so much better in one's head than it does when I get to sit here. Just thinking of a couple different things that you mentioned, but the reform effort itself, and now being outside of the government and seeing it from an industry perspective, definitely is very different. I agree that ECR has not happened the way that it was envisioned. There was a lot of assumptions made on the government side when they were initiating and proposing a lot of these changes. There was a lot of good intentions, how it was being done. But I think where some of the issues come in is a lot of the folks in the regulatory process, so within the Department of State, Defense, and Commerce, are lifetime regulators, are lifetime government employees. I know for myself, I started at DDTC when I was in graduate school, so I was, went straight in from, just the academic world right into being a regulator. There's not a lot of experience and understanding of what the words mean on the outside, how they're implemented, how it works. There's not a lot of practical experience. You were mentioning like the control lists and making that process happen. I agree it would be wonderful if they could have done those a lot faster, the list, but there was a lot of discussion, a lot of voices to satisfy with the reform effort. I can give you an example of Category 11, which is military electronics, which had to go out for 2 proposed rules to get it right, or as right as possible in its current state. But just in that first discussions, it took almost a year for the engineers from Commerce Department and Defense Department to sit down and remove from the discussion their personalities, their personal views. Department of Defense, no offense to people who are on the government side in here or anything, Department of Defense honestly does not trust commerce. So there was a lot of not wanting things to move over because there was a distrust of how commerce would happen. Everything would be no license required and never would see anything again. So there was a lot of discussion on what really meant for something to be significant. So you had people who were DoD engineers who had been in this field for years, but in their own world in a way, where the Department of Commerce engineers are definitely have a lot more exposure with industry, are a lot more advanced in what's progressing, what's moving, what other countries are doing in promoting that business, where Department of Defense very focused on, we want to protect our stuff, not realizing that that stuff is commonly available everywhere else, which the Commerce Department is. So there was a meeting of many minds and trying to make decisions and come up, for lack of a better word, to have an adult walk into the room to be like, good, now we're done. We can propose this for a rule. But a lot of it was within the government didn't really know where to start because they didn't know how to apply it on the outside. They know what the words are, they know what they'd like to see, but they don't know it until they see it because they don't know what it means to be in a company to say, all right, so everything was ITAR up till today, so we always got a license for everything. Now we've got to figure out, as you were mentioning, Lindsay, the is it 600 series, if I need to provide a service on it now, but it's on the aircraft, that's ITAR, and, trying to figure out all these things. The government didn't really have an appreciation for that. But I also think that there was an equal impact that when a lot of the proposed rules went out from the government, there was not a lot of industry comment initially, and in discussions with a lot of the industry, especially the big players for aircraft, which was the first rule to go out, they honestly didn't think it was really going to happen. So they didn't take it probably, I won't say it seriously, but didn't put as much effort into reviewing the rules, putting in comments. So the government went along thinking, all right, this looks good, everything's all right, no one said anything, so there must not be a problem. And then it gets into implementation, or even in the companies that did comment, not the right people in the company reviewed the rules. You know, the engineers didn't see the lines and say, well, I don't even know what that says. I've been a radar engineer for years and I don't even know what you're asking me. You know, there wasn't any of that public comment, but then you had a final rule, and now it's trying to work through that. But I think one of the pushes, though, the reform effort was to put something out in writing, because as much as reform had been promised for many, many years, this was the first time it was actually going to be published. And there was the idea that it needed to be out, needed to see how it worked, and then go back and continually update it. The government has said on numerous occasions that it is not set in stone. They were willing to make changes, make edits as necessary, but they need to know what they are. They need to hear the complaints. They need to hear what it means, and really be able to understand that. But I do agree that, especially now from being out of the government for just over 2 years, and seeing how things are implemented, a lot of the problems with the way the reform effort is kind of moving along is individual people may not have been on board. So you have a lot of folks where the administration, their management, you know, the deputy assistant secretary here or the assistant secretary there is, you know, supportive, signing off on things, gets to a case officer's desk, they're not exactly liking it. They're not agreeing. So you have a lot of inconsistency now, where before it was, while it was burdensome to always get an ITAR license, you generally had an idea of what it was going to be. You had an 85 to 90% approval rate for all authorizations, very few return without actions or denials. But now it is an inconsistent playing field. So while there was a lot of good intentions in how it gets done, just making the regulatory changes didn't change the minds of the people actually implementing those regulations. And I think that legislative change would have been useful, but I'm still not too sure it would have pushed it over the edge, because you still then had that case officer who'd been reviewing those aircraft parts that they still think are vital as ITAR, and not liking that they're gone, but they're the ones who are signing those, you know, signing those authorizations out. So there's a mix of a couple different things in how it's done. But I agree that, you know, many people have the fear of the ITAR over the years, but looking at it from like on a government side, I think that a lot of times on the compliance side at state, they really were focused on just trying to understand and make things better for companies, or so that they understood. So that's why you didn't see as many fines and penalties coming out of state, even though they could have. They could have been more like the Commerce Department, handing out fines and penalties whenever we feel like it, at varying ranges. That they really waited for, you know, companies that had systemic problems or things that they saw were like a disregard. So in a way had intent, but they had a disregard for how the regulations were being done. But I think that, yeah, the reform effort had some good starting points, but now it's kind of getting off track. But a lot of that also has to do with other agencies are now involved. As part of, you're talking about like just to do a single category, you have to have 13 agencies sign off on it. So while you have state, commerce, and DoD engineers develop it, you have to have ATF, Homeland Security, NASA, OMB, all these different offices all come together and agree with what the words say. A lot of little, you know, nitpicking of words and things like that that take a long time to get done, in addition to just doing the everyday job. That there was a great intention to have everything done, and I think everyone wanted it done. It's just too many cooks in the kitchen on that one. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to ramble a little bit there.
No.
But I do see a lot of my work now is helping companies move from the ITAR to understanding the EAR and mixing that. But I think it's interesting that most of the people I talk to, they're just like, can I just go back to being under the ITAR? Because it was easier, because I just knew that if it was there, then I had to get a license, and I didn't have to worry, as Lindsay was mentioning, like the country views and the country charts, that, you know, my exact same product could have 4 different licensing requirements on it, depending on where I'm sending it, who I'm sending it to. So there's a lot more complexity with what's there. I think that there, as much as people didn't like the ITAR, there was a comfort, little security blanket that came along with it. And they kind of like the idea of having the government saying, yes, you can do something, instead of taking that liability on their own to do that. So there's some mixed views on whether or not the reform was the right way of doing it, but also
Good. Let me, so I very much, I appreciate this analysis. I'm sure you're exactly right. You have a lot more experience than me, and it's very cogent. But I think it's an analysis of the problems with the reform process as it's going along right now. And I've no doubt that the reform efforts were well-intentioned, and it was a great idea of the administration to move forward with this. I guess my question is, the original, was it 74 or 76, enabling legislation, gave the president, the executive branch, the authority to introduce regulations. And of course, this flows down to agencies. And as you point out, the problem is there's so many agencies and there's case officers down at the bottom, and they're controlling the things. But it's really the president who has the final. So couldn't the president simply say, give guidance that would, tie the hands of the case officers and basically say, well, these whole categories are no longer relevant to us, so let's go a different direction.
I think technically he could, but I think through the delegations that came through, like the executive orders and such, he removed himself from that role. But I mean, there is nothing that says that he can't come in there and do that. But I think it's more that he's relying on the agencies that he's delegated that authority to and making the informed decisions based on that. But yes, technically, he could do that.
Well,
I mean, I'm not
those of us in, with a defense focus, we would say, well, just let the Defense Department clean it up.
I don't think you want the I'm not too sure that would be the best way. I mean, and that was the primary reason why the Department of Defense doesn't have the rules on that is that, first of all, with the Mutual Security Act and other things are all the predecessors to the Arms Export Control Act, is you didn't want the Department of Defense arming other countries and having the choice of, arming someone today who's going to be or going to be tomorrow and using it more as a tool of foreign policy. So it was always removed from them in that respect. But I think that if you allow the Department of Defense to do that, everything will be significant and will be even more restrictive. And things that are commerce controlled now would end up having a lot more restrictions, and so you would actually have then the ITAR on steroids in that way, and kind of taking over. But yeah, the Department of Defense, because they will always have that view of the national security aspect, and want to control things and not have considerations for human rights concerns, foreign policy concerns, and other aspects of what goes into reviewing an export transaction and making that happen. I think there's.
That was our question.
Yes, John Morris, Kansas. By the way, thank you, good to see you again. Kansas specifically, when you were in the government and you were involved in the process of making these interpretations and building the structure, did you ever run into the case or that we're running into now where we have an international nuclear agreement that we've signed up to, and in that nuclear agreement there's some language about at the midpoint 3 to 5 years down the road about it being legal for the Iranians to buy weapons technology, basically missile-related technology. How do those types of international agreements play in the ITAR process on the one hand, and on the other hand, different question but related, how do you consciously consider streamlining the ITAR process when you're incorporating new things into it rather than just adding more structure to it? And we'll,
I might want to know a little bit more about
we'll come back to that question.
Yeah.
But the first one was, are international agreements that the U.S. has not only signed up to but sponsored going to play in the ITAR process and suddenly allow weapons-related technology to be transferred?
Well, and they kind of go hand in hand in the sense of that the agreements themselves are their own standalones, but the export transactions are going to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis on whether or not at the time and the transaction and those who are involved, whether or not it meets the export requirements. The ITAR won't always be involved in that. That's going to be more the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and energy will be a little bit more involved in that because the ITAR in itself has got a presumption of denial for those categories anyway.
Right.
So even though the agreements may say that this is something that would be considered, whether or not the U.S. government will approve export authorization to take place, totally separate thing. And in most cases, I'm assuming it's going to be a presumption of denial.
And the other question was a process. As new things are being considered in ITAR, are new organizations being considered to be part of the review process, is there a conscious thought at that point to try to streamline the integration of those new things into ITAR from a user perspective, someone who's trying to use ITAR, or does it just add on more layers of red tape?
When you say bringing on new things, are you meaning adding new commodities for control, or just
Right.
new?
Or you know, possibly even some organizational changes within the administration on who has responsibilities for nuances that, you know, maybe they didn't have previously. The bottom line is,
Yeah, it's the same.
whenever
Sure,
any
everything.
change is made to ITAR, is there a conscious effort made to streamline the process? Or
Yeah, I
or
mean,
is it just add layers to it?
No, I mean, in doing the reviews for the ITAR, it was always to make it clearer, make it more streamlined, to avoid bringing in additional parties as necessary. It just seemed as through some of the implementations, other parties have managed to say that they have an ITAR nexus. There's a lot more like homeland security involvement in the ITAR,
Right.
where the ITAR relates to exports, where homeland security deals more with imports. So it's more just wanting to make sure that everyone has a voice. But I think the lines are getting blurred more. But it's not necessarily that the ITAR itself is changing. It's more that the folks that are involved in it are wanting to be more collaborative with the other agencies and such. But the ITAR should only ever stick within the Department of State and shouldn't have other agencies involved in it.
So before I open this up, I want to give our final panelists a chance to comment on this. So we were just talking about, before that question, a little issues about national security. And our final panelist today can absolutely speak to these national security issues. Peggy Evans is a senior fellow here at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and she retired from the government in 2013 after 24 years of experience in intelligence and national security programs, including the CIA, the White House, and the Senate. As a budget director for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence from 2009 to 2013, Peggy developed strategies for reviewing the roughly $70 billion budget in intelligence in anticipation of a period of declining resources. During her tenure, the SSCI passed 4 bills in succession that were signed into law after a drought of 5 years with no authorization act. With that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Peggy Evans for a minute so she can speak to some of the national security issues regarding the ITAR.
Well, thank you very much. I am no expert, and I'll stipulate that at the outset, on ITAR, on the regulations, on the process. I come at this primarily, almost entirely, as a policy official and intelligence officer. So when I think about ITAR, and I think about the original intent, both economically in terms of the national security, I take it more at a policy level. And I think there are some fundamental things that have changed, which my fellow panelists have addressed. And in the economic arena, I think we need to understand that the global economy has changed at the strategic level from being an engineering and manufacturing economy to what I call the genius information technology economy. And that the advances that the national security community has to keep in mind in order to continue to do its job, which is to get ahead of the adversary, stay ahead of the adversary, and deter the adversary from engaging in activity inimical to our interests. What goes along with the change in the global economy is the global workforce. The change in the post-secondary education globally has resulted in a great deal of talent, particularly in the information technology realm, that's growing up elsewhere. That global workforce follows the money, and the money, in many cases in this arena, from the venture capitalist world, is interested in making money and working with the government is no longer the assured way of making money. So, if the economy is changing and the workforce is changing, and they're all following the money, the threat to the national security, I believe, rests in that space. So what does that mean in real life? It means that we have a workforce that isn't necessarily dominated by U.S. persons. So where do we find the talent to create the capabilities that keep the United States ahead of its adversaries if they're not U.S. citizens? What do we do when the money originates not in the United States, but in an oligarchy in Western Europe, for example, or other sources of funding where again the United States used to dominate? What does it mean for how the United States government and the national security community is going to have the technologies to continue to protect us from our adversaries? When I think about the national security, I always start with the most broad definition, which is, what is an existential threat to the United States of America? And it isn't necessarily a terrorist event, as appalling as that may be. It's the sort of thing that brings the United States together. It's weapons of mass destruction, which can be anything from what we're traditionally used to with nuclear, biological, radiological weapons, but it's also a cyber threat. If you can bring down the critical infrastructure of the United States and you begin to see the rending of the social fabric internally, that's an existential threat to the United States. So what are the technologies we need to be ahead and stay ahead in order to deter the enemy from striking against us? And when I look at the ITAR regime and the companies that I work with and the public policy officials that I work with, I think we're starting with the process instead of starting with the goal or the threat. So what one can perceive is that every time we create a new prohibition, we're painting more of the floor and painting ourselves into the corner, where we can't reach out, we can't collaborate, we can't take advantage. We're essentially forcing the money and the people and the development out of our country. That, to me, is the threat.
Thank you for that.
I think I'd like to open it up and see people's reactions at this point. Professor Mogisi.
My name is Alan Busi. I'm a regulator, former regulator. I'm familiar with environmental, public health, except for the regulations that you just described. Your presentation I apologize, I came a few minutes late, so I may have missed something. Your presentation identified a whole bunch of problems, but hardly any recommendation of what to do about them, with the exception of what at the last minute Peggy said. I think all of you addressed key issues. Let me identify a couple of issues identified, which are not really issues in the sense. Multiple agencies. What's new about multiple agencies? The pesticides are regulated by the EPA, by the Food and Drug Administration, and by the Department of Agriculture, to mention a few. The question is not that I have multiple agencies. The question is the responsibilities of the individual agencies properly determined and identified? Let me use another one. My life as a regulator, the regulated industry wanted to have performance-based, and you identified the performance regulations. Instead of saying, put a gadget on the top over there, and you are complied with the regulations. Now, but I listened to I think the two of you, the industry says, I'm a small industry, a small business, and unless I comply with the but I don't know how to comply with them. The reason being, the objective is improperly identified. Not only that, a small business does not have enough money to look at what this and that. There ought to be a place, in my opinion, in which the Environmental Protection Agency has tried to do that, and as OSHA, to identify a place where the small business go and says, I want to do this. Can I do that? The point that I'm trying to make really, what I was very much like to hear, is what should the new regulation, first of all, is, as I heard it, about how the law works. Of course, all laws are passed by the Congress, and the executive branch is responsible for the development of the regulation and their enforcement. What should happen if a new law is read, and in addition to that, how should then, and you identified, Peggy identified some very key issues, not only nuclear, chemical and biological, but also cyberspace. How should these be addressed in a manner that is performance-based, and if a small business need assistance, how can you help the small business to comply with them?
I was just saying there's a lot of things in that one. Yeah. My first thought was when you're talking about, having a space or a place for small business to go to, I just think about the size of the group of people who administer this set of regulations, 125 people, and that is it. So there's not a lot of folks to have that that outreach, that outsourcing, and that has been one of the issues the industry has mentioned is that there isn't a way for them to come in and have those discussions, but a lot of it has to do with the small number of people and not well resourced. They're a small office within a much larger agency that generally doesn't acknowledge their existence. But I agree that the multi-agency aspect has been there for years. And it's been there with export controls as well for years. I just think that for many the folks, especially in the defense industry, they haven't had to deal with multi-agencies. They've had generally defense and state were their two people, their two agencies, and that was all that they had. So now it is something new for them to have to be managing so much more than what was there before. And that there are more people wanting to be involved, which hadn't before. Most folks, and when I say folks, other government agencies didn't want to get involved or didn't get involved, weren't asked, didn't volunteer. So there was a lot of stovepiping within the regulation. So it's new for the offices themselves to now be interacting with other agencies in a collaborative effort rather than just a referring transaction. So there is for them it's more of a mindset change that needs to happen, and understanding is that it can be collaborative, it should be, and being able to open up in that way. They're very, stovepipe is the only word I can think, but they're very much internal looking. They don't have that experience from other government agencies that are other regulatory agencies. They tend to think that they're on an island on their own, which they create themselves. So there are a lot of things that they need to learn, but for most of the folks, I think, in the export world, this is the first time that they're having to see the multi-agencies. It was either one or the other, and that is all that they had to do. But finding that information, Department of State has never been good at publishing information or getting information out about the regulations. As you were mentioning, like the strict liability, if you didn't know what the State Department's website was, that was the only thing you ever knew of anything changing, because they don't publish, they don't go out, they don't speak. Generally, they aren't forward moving in that way. I remember a former boss who told a congressional hearing, we're the only game in town. If they don't play with us, they can't play with anyone legally. And so there was always that view of just like, we're it. You come to us, you have our regulations, and we're not here to help you, kind of thing. So that's always been kind of unfortunately, a mentality there.
Well, but certainly the reform effort, one of the main intentions was to turn that around.
Oh yeah, most definitely. It was to for, actually, I was listening to Kevin Wolf recently at a conference saying that a lot of the initiatives of the reform effort was to get the regulators back on track. Because the regulators were no longer regulators, they were enforcers or other things. They themselves did not know their own regulations because they were in their own little world of, hey, I asked for this, you give it to me, and then I'll approve your license. Rather than, did the regulations actually require that? No. They had gotten off track from that. So there was a lot of arbitrary and kind of capricious type actions that needed to be resolved. And a lot of that was because they were an insular agency.
So export.gov, oh, I'm sorry, go right ahead, Lindsay.
No.
Well, export.gov is supposed to be a one-stop shop where you can go get assistance, but the problem is, and as Lindsay really pointed out, you go get assistance and find out that there's a subpart A of 3.705 that, and these 5 agencies that you need to go to, and you need to apply for an export license, and maybe this and that. Just the complexity, which has grown over the years and now continues to grow, it has this suppressing effect.
I have a couple of thoughts in response to your question as well. So I think what we're trying to do here, if you take a reflection back on the ECR, the export control reform, we're trying to modify a system. So we've got this, behemoth, and we're trying to modify it. My question is, why not scrap it and start anew?
I'll give you a good story about that.
I mean, effectively, we're trying to do this modification. We've got all of these different agencies. You look at, post 9/11, we suddenly had a new agency come about, DHS, right? New laws, so, this is forward thinking. Perhaps it's time to say, okay, modification didn't work. Let's look at a new platform where you don't have the competing agencies. We can think back to the whole satellite issue of state control, commerce control, state control. How did that work out for us all? So I think that there has to be some mindset, and maybe it's neither this piecemeal modification, which I think the intent was there to try and bring it together and streamline. If there was one word, it was single, and then the second word was streamline. So I think the intent was there, but I think as a practical matter, the implementation of that over the years got out of hand. I've never been in government, but I've certainly been interpreting the regulations for 28 years from a number of different agencies, so I have appreciation from the business side of it. I think with regard to small business and how they interact, I think there have been efforts. Export.gov, there's been an affirmative outreach program. We're going to go out and we're going to train and we're going to educate. But at the same time, there's been a push to say, look, we have limited resources. We have increasing exports and diminished resources within the government. Therefore, thank you very much. We'd like to push the burden to you. Self-classify in light of strict liability and everything else. So you, Mr. Small Business, come to our training, we'll help you, we'll educate you, but then you make the final call. Well, that makes a lot of small businesses, medium-sized businesses nervous. They're like, no thanks. We want to go in and you tell me I don't need a license. I want to put it in the paper. So that doesn't solve the problem either. And then I think, if you look at other areas of concern, I think one by analogy is privacy, right? Privacy, cybersecurity is a huge issue. Thus far, we don't have regulations on privacy. What we do have, however, are businesses that have come together to provide, collaborate on, and produce self-regulatory instructions, where they say, we're going to take this one on. The government is certainly watching it and has a hand in it. But on the privacy front, you see over in EU what happened with that, and the court's decision have had a step back. But in the U.S., thus far, it has not been put forward. So is there an opportunity there for greater self-regulation in terms of establishing what the goalposts are, and in performance, I think, in particular?
Peggy, let me ask, I obviously can't sell a chemical weapon agent internationally. Can I sell a zero-day exploit?
So I would ask the question differently.
Okay.
I would say, who's able to create a zero-day exploit? And are we incentivizing our companies and our talent expert into working to create a new video game. So I know that that's kind of an unfair thing to say, but it really boils down to this point. Can you stop the advancement of the science? You can't. We used to always be the ones, because of our very gifted military-industrial complex in the engineering age, to always be ahead. But this is a different type of threat environment, and until we acknowledge that we can't stop what it takes just a single genius to create, then we have to understand what the state of industry is. And not the state of the art, but the state of the industry, and not set up our industrial companies to be unable to compete. And what I liked about your kind of reboot approach to starting over is, I think we have to re-examine the assumptions. Why are we doing this? Who are the ones that are doing it? And how is it done? And while self-regulation has a lot of appeal, and I think that that is a reasonable approach for a huge segment of the areas that we currently require to go through this laborious process. I still think there is a subset of capabilities that we have to treat as crown jewels and that we do have to understand. I just feel like at the end of the day, if we start thinking about this again, we'll find out that 95% of what we regulate is essentially state of the industry. And somebody else, somewhere else, is capable of creating, producing, and selling it. So all we're doing is holding our industry back and encouraging our talent to work in another arena that's commercially driven.
I would agree with that. I think if you look and you say foreign availability, is there foreign availability? That's a good starting point to figure out what is state of the art or not.
Thanks. Hey, my name's Bill Landay. I've kind of lived around this both on the science side and then the international sales side from the DoD perspective. So I come with that tainted view, I suppose. But, my view of this, and I think, Lindsay, in your discussion, you really highlighted it, this system is so much more complex today because the system is trying to adapt to exactly the environment you talked about. So in 1976, this was pretty straightforward. It was all built by the U.S., U.S. companies, internal to the U.S., and when we sanctioned the country, we sanctioned the country. Now we sanction the army of a country, but industry very much wants to sell to the Navy and the Air Force of that same country, and we're trying to adapt in a way that allows us to do that. So I think while it's complex, I think we've got to recognize that the system is trying to recognize the environment that you're talking about. Multinational global companies, foreign nationals moving back and forth. How do you address that from an ITAR perspective? Well, you've got to put the responsibility further down in the organization. So I think to kind of simply say, well, we ought to start all over again is a little simplistic, may be the right way to go, but I would be interested in hearing your thoughts of how you would do that, because regardless of how you start, you're still going to run into a couple of issues. There will be technology that people in the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, the CIA, whoever it is, are going to consider to be critical crown jewels, national security. And we're going to want to be able to protect that. At the same time, industry is going to say, but you have to allow me to operate globally, so how are we going to make those happen? And then the reality is, and this is what Candace lived, when that technology gets out, the first place we go to are to the regulators and say, how the heck did you allow this technology to be sold to this country 15 years ago? And we bash the heck out of folks. So like in anything else, you hate the engineers because they always get in the way of the program manager until the ship sinks. And then the first thing you do is you turn to the engineer and say, how'd you let the ship sink? So I think, we have to recognize that there is a piece of this that it's easy to say that, but in the end, the government does want to control those. So, kind of a long introduction to, I'd be interested in your thoughts of, if you were to start over again, what you would do to start over again. And I know, you've kind of mentioned it, part of the thing is, well, we just would have less stuff be ITAR controlled. But regardless of whatever you have ITAR controlled, you're still going to run into these same issues. So I'd be interested in what your thoughts are on kind of things we ought to think about going forward differently that might allow us to address this issue.
I know we just sort of dropped this STEPS article on you all, but the position that I take in my article, that you have this reprint, is that we should rescind the entire regulation and start over. So now when I say that, and I should again emphasize that's my personal opinion, I'm not talking on behalf of the Potomac Institute here. In fact, what we're trying to do is formulate some policy recommendations, and that's not necessarily it. And for exactly the reason, Bill, you say, is that when I've said that in the past, people gasp and say, and replace it with what? So I too am interested in what the panel would have to say about that. But I will point out that the ITAR affects defense articles, which includes physical defense systems, you know, selling a ship or a plane or even a piece of software. I still consider that a physical thing that you're selling. It also affects technical information, knowledge, systems about things. And they're really two different areas that, and my article, by the way, focuses on the information side of things. But one other point is that in terms of the Defense Department, we have a classification regime. There are other ways of protecting information. It does turn things around. It's not based upon self-regulation or self-classification. It's based upon a classification authority saying thou shalt not, and you don't have to think about it. You just don't export or reveal classified information except under the proper circumstances. So, and in our first seminar, that the previous one in this series, Sarah from the Department of State explained that ITAR was really intended as sort of a classification light system. And the problem with that is that therefore there's a lot of things that probably should be classified that people say, oh, well, it doesn't matter, we'll just call it ITAR. And so in my article, again, I say, by virtue of having a classification light system, you're hurting national security, because the ITAR system doesn't really protect information from getting emailed around in a new communication regime. Anyway, Candace, what do you think about
Before we start, could I complicate it just a little bit?
I'm Craig Childress with no particular affiliation. I like the idea of, you know, blow it up and start over. However, in the America of today, not the America of 1974, 1976, in the America of today, you know, as Peggy said, follow the money. And follow the congressional committees. You know, I thought Lindsay did a great job of saying you've got DHS involved, you've got DOD involved. I mean, they're obviously the 900-pound gorilla. You've got state that wants to be the 900-pound gorilla. You've got commerce. You've got, you know, as someone pointed out, you've got FDA. You've got all these people. Well, all of those agencies also have any number of committees and subcommittees in both the Congress and the House and the Senate who feel like they have a dog in the fight. And you have jobs, people. And in Washington, the size of your budget, you know, sort of decides the size of your ego. I mean, sorry, not to be too cynical. I mean, how do you accommodate that as well? Who's going to pull all that together? You know, someone said, well, the president could. Well, yeah, for about a second, until, you know, this congressman and that senator and whatever decided, nope, you can't pull that out of my bailiwick because now you're diminishing my monetary authority and therefore my power, not on my watch.
asking was doing just that, blank piece of paper, start over. They spent almost 11 months. No one would give us ground. So you had DOD, State, and Commerce all sitting there trying to say what were like the better aspects of what they did and trying to develop this. No one was willing to do that. And what they did try to come up with, probably not the clearest, but Congress came in and said, we don't like this because we lose our oversight, we lose our purview into things. There's a lot of things that have transitioned to commerce that several committees no longer have insight into, but now they've manipulated that system so that they do have insight, even though technically through the, how the executive orders and the different aspects work of who reports to who, they now have some additional oversights and such. Congress had a huge role in how some of these changes have been done. That's also why some of the changes are probably as painful as they are. I mean, we don't even want to talk about foreign military sales and what that does within all of this. But Congress came in saying, you can't touch that part. That part stays ITAR. You can't move that. We want continued oversight, which then made a larger mess of the system in that way. But it really was an effort originally to try and start over. What is it that we really need to control? What do we care about? Let's look at our regime commitments. There's the export controls are based on 4 primary regimes. How do we work from that? No one could agree on how they wanted to do it because each agency has their own interpretations and each had their own roles in that no one was really willing to give up. That's how we ended up with let's modify it and make changes to what is already there to kind of make the best of what we've got right now, because a lot of it does require legislation. The Arms Export Control Act can change. The Export Administration Act cannot change unless Congress initiates it. The agencies can say all they want. We love the ADCA to change, the EAA, or the IEPA, whichever part is actually keeping the Commerce Department going. They can want that to change all they want, but until there's a congressman or someone standing up there that says, yes, we're going to take forward those changes, it's not going to happen. And so as much as the president wants to do this, if Congress isn't willing to support that, and through my years of dealing with the ITAR, I watched Congress do all sorts of fun stuff in that way, where they, I just thinking about under President Bush, one of his directives, which another issue of the ITAR is companies have to pay a registration fee and a license fee for everything that they do. So they pay the Department of State hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to regulate this, but Congress has always refused to make the regulatory change or the legislative changes to the AECA to let that money be used. So it just sits there and growing in a big account somewhere, getting interest thrown on it. It's wonderful, but no one can touch it because the AECA hasn't been changed, even though the president directed a change. There's not that corollary. So that, as much as it would be great to have those two things working in concert together, it really is left to the worker bee level to try and make a lot of these fixes and a lot of the changes. And I think it's something else to remember when looking at the control list, and this was something that was brought up in some of the proposed rules when they first went out, is foreign availability is always something that is considered, but putting things on the U.S. munitions list or keeping things there for control aren't always for technical reasons. They aren't always for, this is the most advanced it is. It's also for non-proliferation concerns. Wanting to know what U.S. companies are interacting with. Who are they doing business with? Are they developing missiles with a country we don't want them to be developing missiles with? Well, the technology in itself may be something that's commonly available. Wanting to be able to regulate and watch how U.S. technology is being utilized. So it isn't always that they can go to the French, they can go to the Israelis, or whoever else to get this. It's making sure that the U.S. is kind of staying clean in a lot of these things and wanting to look at that and watching where things are going and watching proliferation trends. So it isn't always because it is the crown. Yeah, and I think when people look at that, it's just, that it's this, the stigma on that. But also that a lot of the European countries in themselves too, but a lot of the others who are adherents to these regulations or to their own regimes have the same export controls. They just don't have the extraterritoriality that the Arms Export Control Act has. UK companies can't just export military goods without a license, nor can the French, nor can the Germans or anything. It's just they do not have this follow-on, which is what has made the ITAR such a burden for most U.S. companies, is because the French don't want to have to comply with U.S. law. But the French companies in themselves have their own set. They have to deal with technology, services, exports of hardware. It's just once it's out of their country, it's out of their country. Their laws don't further follow that on. So I think that's where, the sphere of the ITAR, wanting the ITAR-free products has come from is, having that idea that just that single bolt, not many bolts left, but that idea that one little item could then taint a whole aircraft that's not a U.S. aircraft. Just that idea that it happens in other countries in that way. And countries are actually becoming more like the U.S. Australia has changed their laws. The UK is in the process of changing theirs to have a little bit more of the extraterritoriality. So as much as the U.S. has changed or is kind of lessening theirs, the U.S. is actually kind of pushing other countries to do the same thing.
Which, if you did it for a smaller pie, would make a lot of sense.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I agree. Yeah.
But if you
Yeah.
look at if we had the type of people involved in the process who had more expertise than the typical government regulator, and a independent body that determined what state of the industry is globally, then you have that starting point. And that would permit you and permit the regulators to focus on things that really matter, to be able to rely on external expertise, not in industry, with no disrespect meant to any given company who's looking to export things that make people nervous. But when I said that we have to look at why we do it, we have to look at who does it and how do they do it. And I think at the end of the day, you would find that there would be a smaller pie of greater risk with the right people for the government to confer with to aid in that determination of whether it's commoditized. And let me just point out a very extreme example that's happened over the last 3 or 4 years in the U.S. economy, which is the commercial imagery market, right? When you have a process where DoD and the intelligence community, which, by the way, produces satellites and really could be accused of not wanting competition to create capabilities that the USG heretofore has done with little regulation and virtually no cost capping, is there integrity in that process? And we went from 2 commercial providers to 1, and have heard a great deal about how Wall Street is interpreting not only what the USG is buying, but what the USG is permitting this company to sell elsewhere without sufficient consideration of what those customers can already buy elsewhere. Then you've got a classic case of where the perfect is the enemy of the good here.
Well, I guess I would just add that I think that was the intent of the reform. Think back to it. It was the taller fences around the crown jewels. So I think the intent was there. I think the idea was right. I think the process just got bogged down in that. And I think, as Dr. Homola said, we do have a system in the classified world where the very sensitive are controlled for the concerns of who's doing what with whom, as well as what is being handled. So that model is out there, whether it's one that can be further adapted to incorporate the most sensitive, again, the smaller grouping of that which is currently ITAR controlled, perhaps, and then examining the largest subset, which has the least restriction on it, kind of the commerce dual use products in another manner, then perhaps that's a more effective way forward.
I want to put something out there right now. We're talking here about some of the complications we have with the ITAR and the enabling legislation that's there. And all these things that we're talking about, maybe we write a new law or maybe we write these new regulations. These seem like static solutions to a dynamic problem. And I think part of getting around all of this, or finally addressing it, is to look at this as a dynamic problem, that even if we made the best law or the best set of regulations, in 10 years we're going to have to come back to that. And so really when we start talking about how we might start to fix this, I'd be really interested in getting thoughts on kind of, I think Peggy had mentioned it, but kind of like, what is the end state here? What is the goal we're constantly trying to achieve? And then how can we establish a process and the proper measures of accountability and the right performance metrics that we can keep us in check and making sure we're getting there? And that we're looking at this as this ongoing effort and not this one and done kind of solution that we'll be able to fix. So, any comments on kind of where we should be heading and kind of where that end state and what it looks like?
Well, I have one thought on that. If you look conversely to imports, we've got the same harmonized tariff schedule. It's about yay thick, 6 inches thick or so. And yet that schedule undergoes a yearly review because, it was originally established 100 years ago plus, and yet there's a constant review of that because as technology develops, as the widgets develop, there's this concern, or at least an acknowledgement, that the regulatory process and the classification per se needs to keep up. The same has not happened on this side with any sort of precise, regular, predictable review with input from industry, with input from government, with input from, all parties, whether it's policy issues or commercial issues or fungibility issues. So I think that that's a nice model that could be potentially adapted on the export side.
And I think that they've started to do that because one of the plans was, and it's actually being implemented, is that they did the first rule change for aircraft, went into effect October 2013. 16 months later, they put out a rule saying, how is it working? And they're now going through those public comments, and they're going to be updated. They have a schedule that every 16 months they are going to do a review, 16 to 20 months, depending on how they're going to work it, but that they're going to do a review of each of the categories as they come along, so they will be continually updating and moving things on. And I think that they're really trying to stress the fact that while it's reform right now for everyone to adjust, it's just going to become a way of life. That the U.S. munitions list, for almost 50 years was the exact same list, except for the addition of 2 categories in the 80s. The first, I had at home everything, this copy of the original ITAR from 1936. I had the 36 through 39. There's copies of the original ITARs. And it's just like to note, the same issues were there. The commercial aircraft industry was complaining about the ability to support allied forces. So, it was really interesting that we still keep coming full circle on that stuff. But that the lists are going to be continually updated. And that they bought that when the State Department said, yes, we're going to do the reform effort, that we know we're going to have to keep updating the list and that it will be continually changing. So the aircraft category you see today will be different next month, could be different a year from now. That they are going to continually be doing it, but it's out for public comment. They just released the next set for land vehicles and vessels, which were the next category to ask them what additionally needs to be changed, how are things impacting there, what needs to be cleaned up. And so that's going to be continually there, and I think they're going to start doing that then, of course, with all the other aspects of the regulations. I think it's just the lists are the ones that tend to be the bigger issues. But then get into some of the other areas of the exemptions and such. Moving forward.
I'd be happier with that if it wasn't still 21 lists on the ITAR, USML, and another chunk on the commerce side.
And it's hard to kind of get rid of 21 because they're platform driven. Right. So you have an aircraft category, you have a vehicle platform, you have a vessels, and unless you decide that you're just going to merge all of them into one category, it kind of, and it also follows how the Boston-R is broken up. The Boston-R arrangement has, there are 20 categories, so it follows, or 21 categories, 22 categories. I always forget about their technology and their software on the side. But it follows in how the other regimes do theirs as well. So the munitions list generally will always have that. It's just a little bit smaller as they go along, but they generally are always going to be platform driven, unlike the Commerce Department and how they look at theirs more as a functionality rather than a platform. But I don't think you'll ever get rid of the 21. It's just one of these days, who knows, all the firearms may disappear, wander over to Commerce. Not likely, but just a thought. Oh, yeah. Another one of those guys popped up last week, so that should be interesting.
Hi, Jim Bauer. Played around in the ITAR world for a while too. One comment, then the question. So the comment is, for those of us who work in the highly classified arena, when there's ITAR added to the slides, it's usually really hard to deal with the Five Eyes and other folks who are in the audience. It's actually, we'd like to take that out of there because then it's a lot easier to talk about our classified information, the real crown jewels. So I guess the question from the small business standpoint, I support a number of small businesses looking at foreign opportunities. And we're seeing some companies that start to design and build unmanned air systems overseas so that they're ITAR free, with additive manufacturing, with this globalization of the workforce. Do you see this happening more and more, and so that companies are just going to continue, especially the small businesses, try to find a way to build that next rocket motor overseas, build the next components overseas, build the software overseas? I want to build some ITAR compliant mission planning software, so I go overseas to do that.
Yes.
I think that was like a big push, is that trying to get away from people developing the ITAR free because of that extraterritorial aspect of it. And it's interesting we talk about like the ITAR free aspect. I now hear just US free, because the EAR has its own re-export, retransfer requirements that are similar to the ITAR in that way, even on the dual use side as well as the 600 series side. So you have, it's kind of like shifted to just being one regulation. Now it's just all US regulations I want to get away from. But unfortunately, I think that that's always going to be there, so long as the regulations have that extraterritorial nexus for continually controlling the transfer or the use of that information, the use of the hardware. The regulations say until it's either rendered useless or destroyed, the U.S. has a hook into it. I mean, the U.S. is still regulating F5s that they sold 30 years ago, that they aren't selling new ones of, but any time one of those F5s gets used somewhere, the U.S. government gets to have a chop on it. But I think that that's always going to be an issue, just because of how the regs evolve.
So let's just turn that on its head for just a second and say, for a long time we required foreign governments to have U.S. subsidiaries in order to be able to address it. What that scenario incentivizes is going exactly the other way, right? Having a foreign entity with foreign employees and foreign investment dollars and developing products that are sold in foreign countries where the tax consequences benefits that country instead of the United States. We've kind of just turned the whole model, the incentive structure on its head.
Oh yeah, no, and a lot of U.S. companies do that. They have their U.S. company, and then all their non-U.S. subsidiaries have no access to U.S. technology or their hardware. They develop their own. They do their own for that, because also the U.S. companies don't want to then have their products, but then they get their royalties and benefits off of their subsidiary sales. They want to be able to get that, but without that impact.
Right up until they invert.
Right. But that is you see that with a lot of the U.S. companies. But I think it's probably also kind of like a weirder issue than when you have like a European company who is a U.S. subsidiary. So it tends to be, the regulations make more sense there, just because they don't want also the non-U.S. technology to get into the U.S. and then get messed around and then now become U.S. They don't want to have that taint in that direction either. So yeah, I mean, the regulations in themselves are just not conducive to that, as we were saying before. I mean, they are what we used to call internally a Cold War document, because it really was just about protecting everyone against the world. But that U.S. companies made things for the U.S. military, and when they did go outside the U.S. and do things, it was to support another government. It wasn't to have collaborative exercises or development with a private company in another country. That wasn't what the regulations were ever intended for, because that just wasn't the way the business was done. I mean, the last time the ITAR was actually ever really updated or modified was in 1984. Again, it still references faxes and paper copies and, hand carries of documents. I mean, it doesn't, account for emails, cloud computing, all that stuff, because it's just an unknown. Yeah, because, I mean, that's just not the way regulations, as we were saying before, the regulations have not kept up with industry. And that's one reason of looking at trying to move things to the Commerce Department, is because they do have a lot more flexibility, while it is much more complex, in being able to utilize their license exceptions and do business and such. But there was a lot of things that I think that they wanted to change within the ITAR, but a lot of it either required congressional approval, an amendment to the ITAR, or an actual change to the APCA itself that they could not get moving. So it was trying to do the 80% solution by making all these other changes that didn't require those changes, but hopefully just make things a little bit better. But ultimately ended up being a little bit more complicated and complex.
I would just add to that, I think that one of the challenges is that long arm and heavy hand outside of our jurisdiction, because the regulations and the restrictions follow the thing, whether the thing is the technology, the widget, whatever, the individuals. And so that re-export, what we're seeing overseas of other countries now implementing more stringent, is simply a tit for tat. And recognizing that now their businesses that are affiliated with U.S. businesses and or using U.S. origin goods, technology, and the like are now exposed to liability under our books and records and rules. And so I think there's a bit of that concern as well.
Could I suggest an outcome a la Peggy Evans? If the outcome, the desired outcome, one desired outcome would be to allow companies to obtain ITAR approval through the entire process within 2 weeks, how would you modify the process to enable that? I realize that may be not attainable, but how would you work toward that goal? What changes would you make to the ITAR process?
I'm just in here trying to think of,
Number one, get access to the funds that are locked up to help support additional resources.
Because that was the whole point of doing the registration
Right.
fees, is for them to become
Because remember,
self-funded and-
small businesses don't have access to the funds to go out and hire the team of lawyers it takes to get through the ITAR process.
Right.
Sometimes it can be very complicated.
And I think that there's a lot that can be done, like State Department.
Okay.
The regulators that are there are regulators. They are not technical in nature. So they are required to refer almost everything to the Department of Defense to do with the engineering analysis. There are no engineers, and nor are they coded, even if they have an engineering background, to do engineering. So a lot of it is that referral to the Department of Defense. But so if there was State Department had engineers on staff that could do those initial reviews and such, that would cut down on a lot of the processing time.
Could I suggest that you establish deadlines for the people who are the real required people in the process, and all of the support people have to work within their deadlines?
So there are 2 sets of deadlines.
Okay.
The first one is internal within State Department, so like the country desk, human rights, they all have 15 days to respond. The NSPD 56 that President Bush put into place that did the self-financing also put on a requirement that all cases have to be adjudicated and approved within 60 days. But it came with exceptions. And this is where the joyful part comes in, is the primary exception is when the Department of Defense is doing a technical review. They can have as much time as they want. So until you rein that in, the majority of licenses that exceed
Until you rein it in.
Oh, I know.
Your mind is open now. It's, what would you do it? What would you require it?
I would you were king.
If I was king, there's so much that I would, I was gonna say,
I mean, those are the
I'd be
ideas you
wanting
need
just
to bring
there-
out
There'd be
here.
a lot that would kind of fix a lot of those. But the big thing is that technical assessment. I mean, that having the engineer have the State Department have its own folks to be able to do that assessment, they could probably get a lot of those cases moved and done within, a couple weeks.
Maybe not even as an employee, right? Because what you
Oh, yeah,
want
you
is
can have it-
rotating
Oh, yeah, you can have them as
capability that
contractors.
it has the international
Well,
state of the industry knowledge.
And that's the key, because like right now, State Department DDTC is 60% contract staff. They aren't all civil servants. There's only 40% for civil servants, the rest are contractors, and you could have rotating people who come in who do the analysis and have that. I mean, it would be a great way to be doing that, but that would be accessing the money, first of all, to be able to do that.
So one example, as you said, is set shorter examples for the analysis. How you do that's different, but set shorter, okay.
So, we started this conversation, Bob, with, what are some recommendations that the institute makes? Candace, thank you very much for reading my mind and answering my question. The question was, are the regulators by definition engineers? And the answer is no. And so the next question is, tell me again, why not? No,
Yeah.
it's not a question to you, but says, if you're going to be dealing in things automotive like tanks, tell me again why you're not a mechanical engineer or a chemical engineer or an automotive engineer. If you're doing airplanes and avionics, excuse me, I can teach a monkey to regulate. I can't teach a monkey, sorry.
No, I was gonna say, I
Yeah.
would agree with you,
things
but
you know,
given some of the
but-
monkeys that I had, I'm not so sure.
Engineering is a little bit different,
Yeah,
a
no, I
little
agree.
bit different skill set.
Mhm.
You know, as soon as you said the DOD can take forever, and I instantly thought I hearkened back to my days in the NRO, in Circle A, you know, and everybody that's been in the NRO and the Circle A, stop groaning. But all the FFRDCs, good enough is the enemy of perfect.
Bill, did you have a quick
Yeah,
comment? you
I
wanted
was just
make?
going to say, and Candace, I'm interested in your thought. We've been through this before, and so I think it is certainly something from your view you ought to look at. I think what you'll find, having painfully been through this 2 years ago under Ash Carter, that DDTC approves something like 98% of the licenses that come in within the prescribed timeline, and DITSA turns around something like 95% of the engineering requests within the timeline. It's those that are more complicated that take a long time. NRO stuff is going to be complicated, generally not always because of technology, but you get into the discussions of, do we want to, why should we? And to be perfectly honest, the way the government likes to handle those is they don't like to say no. So you say no by taking no action, which then puts the emphasis on the ITAR people. It's their fault. But in reality, it's not their fault. It's just we didn't want to tell a country no, so we just don't give them an answer. So I think it's something looking at. But just kind of having lived into that, my sense is that piece of it works pretty well for the vast majority of things. It's the complex, unique ones that take longer and probably should. And then I think the other issue you run into, in reality, Department of Defense, just as Department of State, is not going to give up their purview. You could have 1,000 tank engineers in state, but if you think Department of Defense is not going to have a tank engineer review it as well. So I think the process at state has evolved to say, we'll let the technical things be done by the agency most interested in that, and what we'll try to do is manage the regulatory piece of it, which is probably where you ought to belong. So I just think it's something to look at, but it's something to realize that is an area that people have focused on, and we shouldn't get too enamored that this is taking a long time, because I don't think it is.
But I think with the reform effort, because the number of licenses in those things, like the 90% of the things that were reviewed, most of that now has transitioned.
Yeah.
So the things that are left under ITAR's control are those things that are always going to take a long time. So if that process can be reviewed. I mean, it was talking about like bringing in DOD engineers and having them detailed over the state for the initial times and kind of moving things through. But it is a process that probably can be relooked at now that there isn't the hundreds of parts licenses a week for nuts and bolts and gaskets and stuff that aren't controlled anymore. At least not in the ITAR.
Yeah, I think it would certainly be something worth looking at, and I think your point's a good one. Look at it since we've moved those things off of the list. But I will tell you, and coming from NRO, it's kind of the same thing. Those discussions generally are not technical discussions. Those discussions very quickly get to the senior leadership on both sides of, do we want to do this? Why do we want to do this? And it has nothing to do with technical security. It has to do with State Department policy or DOD policy. And you just have to accept that some percentage of those are going to be hard and are going to take some time. The question is, what is that percentage, and can we make that as small as possible?
Well, this has been a really great discussion here, and I've definitely learned some things. And for those who can stay, we'll continue with informal discussions if that's possible. But more importantly, this was the second in a series of workshops and discussions in which we're gathering information, and we'll do an analysis and eventually, hopefully, produce some recommendations for which we won't take any credit, but we will attempt to, as an institute and as a group, accommodate multiple opinions and attempt to move the nation in the right direction to achieve the ultimate goals. Sorry, Dan, but we've run out of time for our formal session here. I want to thank our panelists and those comments that came from the audience as well. So once again, thank you for your participation. Thank you, panelists. And